Today, we're going to talk about weeds in the landscape, plant pests, how to think about them, how to recognize them, and what to do about them. So what is a weed? Well, there is no scientific definition of a weed. There's nothing inherent to the plant itself that makes it something that would be a weed. A weed is a human definition. It's something we prescribe to a plant. And so therefore, a weed is just simply any plant in the wrong place at the wrong time. And I have an image here of a tomato farm because I used to work at a restoration site that was once a tomato field. And when I was planting California native plants in this restoration site, sometimes tomatoes would still pop up from the time when this was a tomato field. And for me, the tomato plants were weeds. I had to remove the tomato plants because I was trying to grow wild habitat. But if we went back in time to when the farmer was growing the tomatoes, those same native plants that I was planting would be considered a weed to the farmer. So a weed is just any plant that's growing in the wrong place. However, there are some plants that can be more weedy than others. They display certain characteristics that will increase the chances for problems in the landscape. So let's talk about some of these weedy characteristics so you can understand why these plants may become a problem. The first characteristic of a weedy plant is reproductive productivity and flexibility. Weedy plants often have a very high seed production. They will create lots of seeds and increase the chances that those seeds can germinate. They also often have more than one way to reproduce. So seeds would be one. Oftentimes they are self-fertile, so they do not require another individual for cross-pollination, or even asexual reproduction via cuttings or rhizomes that spread through the soil and lead to more plants. And so there is a high reproductive productivity as well as flexibility. And a good example of this would be any of our grass species that have stolons and rhizomes that spread horizontally in the landscape and help to reproduce the plant, as well as putting off flowers with viable seeds. Another weedy characteristic of certain plants are that they are highly dispersal. So the seeds themselves can travel far and wide. And a classic example of this would be wind dispersed seeds, for example, dandelions. Weedy plants often have a discontinuous germination or sprouting. And this is helpful for the plant's survival because they can pop up out of germination many points throughout the growing season. What if all the plants germinated at the same time when the conditions were perfect, but then a rabbit came through and ate them all? Or a person came through and pulled all the weeds? It would be more likely that that plant wouldn't survive in the landscape. So the weedy plants, they often have a distributed or discontinuous germination, so that if there's one event that will eliminate or kill the young seedlings, there's a chance in that same growing season for more germination. Adaptability is another weedy characteristic. And here we have an image of Limonium perezii, sea lavender, growing on a coastal cliff, San Diego coastal cliff. And this is showing a landscape plant that does just fine right near the ocean, where there's a high salt spray in the air and adverse conditions in the soil. where many other plants won't do as well. But this same species could do just fine in other landscape type settings. So adaptability to a broad range of growing conditions is a characteristic of a weedy plant. And finally, competitive. So a plant that grows rapidly, a plant that has a large root system and will outcompete, quickly shade out, or more aggressively grow, is going to be likely to win a competition against some of the perhaps more slow growing species. These are all characteristics of weedy plants, whether or not they are called weeds in our landscape. So what are some of the problems that are caused by weeds? Weeds in the landscape may compete with desirable plants for light, water in the soil, or mineral resources. Additionally, they can become a habitat for other pests. Certain pests that may attack our desired plants might take up residence in the weeds, and that would be an entry point into our landscape. Some weeds may cause injury to people or other animals. They could be irritating to the skin. They could be sharp and spiny and cause damage to us. They could be toxic to children, to pets, or to anyone who finds themselves accidentally coming into contact with it, so poisonous plants. Or they could be just highly allergenic, typically releasing pollen that would cause lots of allergies. All of these might be reasons to consider a plant a weed. And then finally, they may just be unattractive and unsightly. And depending on the goal for the landscape, you may want to remove them. Many other types of problems could be caused by a plant that we choose to call a weed, but these are just a few. Now let's take a look at a little video of a plant that has weed in its name, a common name, and let's think about all the weedy characteristics we just discussed and try to identify some of those characteristics when we look at this little video of this plant.
They're prickly, restless, rambling. But if most plants are perfectly content to stay in one place, why does the tumbleweed hit the open road? Tumbleweeds start out as tiny seedlings. They sprout in late winter. By summer, the plant takes on its round shape. They grow flowers nestled between thorny leaves. Inside each flower, a fruit with a single seed develops. This fruit is different than something delicious like cherries. Lucky for the cherry tree, a bird will carry the fruit away in its belly and disperse its seeds. But the tumbleweed takes matters into its own hands. Come fall, the plant dries out and dies. The seeds are still in there. Gusts of wind easily break the dead tumbleweed from its roots. See where it was attached? It looks kind of like bones. A special layer of cells at the base of the plant makes this clean break possible. Then the skeleton is off, shaking loose tens of thousands of seeds as it goes. It turns out some living things spread their seeds better when they're dead. Like cowboys in a western, tumbleweeds head out on the open range. But these icons of the American West actually come from the East, all the way from Ukraine. They're a common weed in Russia too. That's why they're called Russian thistle. They might have hitched a ride here in the 1800s, hidden among flax seeds. Nowadays, they might amble onto the freeway and make you swerve, or get tangled up in your irrigation system. They could even roll into your neighborhood, pile up and become a fire hazard. But a green lawn isn't what the tumbleweed is looking for. It can't compete with plants like grass. It needs a barren place like this abandoned onion field north of Los Angeles. With each bounce, the tumbleweed sends its seeds flying. It spreads them out so they all get plenty of sunlight and space. The coiled up embryo inside just needs a little water to sprout. And soon enough, this plant will strike out on its own.
Thank you to CuriosityStream for supporting PBS Digital Studios.
So there we go with a little video showing the tumbleweed, and weed is in its common name. And we can think about those weedy characteristics. The tumbleweed produces a large number of seeds, and it is highly dispersal with a unique mechanism. It is wind dispersed, however, it's rolling the entire dead plant around, and that is a very effective way to plant those seeds along the path of the wind dispersal. These seeds, when they hit soil and receive a little bit of moisture in the wintertime, are very vigorous in their germination. They can sprout in disturbed landscapes where not many other things can make it. They're very adaptable, and they grow quickly, which makes them highly competitive. And they have those thorns or spines that make animals want to leave them alone. So they have an increased competitive advantage because of their defenses against grazing animals. And what kind of problems do they cause in the landscape? Well, some people may consider tumbleweeds to be attractive, and you may even want to purchase a tumbleweed if you're trying to achieve sort of a Western themed decoration or make a movie or something like that. But in general, the tumbleweeds are a fire hazard. They're not great for livestock, and ranchers tend to not want tumbleweeds around. They can blow onto freeways, cause problems with traffic, and they'll build up along fence lines and overall just create potential problems. So the plant tumbleweed is commonly considered a weed, and the name tells us that it has weedy characteristics, or at one time people considered it to be a weed. But let's think about times when weedy plants may not be considered weeds. One example that's common and popular in the landscape today is planting a plant for butterflies, and that plant is called milkweed. Milkweed because it grows very easily like a weed. It has weedy characteristics. And milk because when you break the plant, there's a white latex type sap that is irritating and toxic to most things. And that's actually a defense mechanism for the monarch. When the caterpillar eats the leaf, it becomes toxic to predators. So milkweed is good for the monarch, and we have native plant milkweeds. So why would we call them a weed? Well, not everything that is weedy is a problem. And if it's not a problem, we don't call it a weed. And let's look at an example in nature of when these weedy plants are actually a good thing and not a problem. We need to look at a certain ecological process. This ecological process is called succession, natural succession. And when we see weeds popping up as a result of disturbance, that is part of natural succession and not always a problem. First off, we start with a healthy ecosystem. And in this case, we're going to have a forest, a deciduous forest. We could call it like our oak woodland. We've got some shrubs down below, a variety of different plants growing, but it's relatively stable. And this would be the desired landscape. Next, we have some kind of disturbance that comes through. And for example, that could be a fire. In Southern California, we are familiar with wildfire, and certainly it has the potential to cause wide-scale disturbance in the ecosystem. So we lose all of the plants. We lose that stable habitat. The oak woodland disappears as a result of the fire. And what we're left with is bare soil. The soil doesn't necessarily disappear. It's not gone. There's just no more plants growing there. And ideally, we wish it had never happened and we could go back to that stable ecosystem. But what happens in nature? Well, first we get the weedy plants to establish. These are plants that thrive in disturbed soils. They can grow very quickly. They can establish root systems. They begin to restore organic matter in the soil. They can eliminate compaction. All of these very aggressive growing plants, all of a sudden they have all the room to spread wildly. And that's what nature wants, because unless plants cover the soil, quite rapidly we can lose that soil to erosion, wind erosion, rain erosion, and the sooner plant roots get into that soil, the better. So in this circumstance, the weedy plants, hopefully they're native plants, but even if they were non-native plants, they have an ecological service. They have a job to do, and it is to very quickly cover the ground and pave the way for future plants to get established. An oak tree would have a difficult time getting established in this full sun environment. However, these weeds have no problem. And the thing about the weeds is they kind of create conditions that eventually push them away. So they will grow and die repeatedly until they build up enough soil organic matter or cast enough shade to then allow more long-lived species to become established. And those longer-lived species usually are more woody shrubs, perennials, even small trees that can grow taller, reach the sunlight, and then begin to cast shade, and then actually outcompete those initial weeds. Eventually, the landscape, we see growth of those, what we would call pioneer or secondary pioneer species. And as they begin to grow, they begin to create the optimum conditions for the desired or the climax ecosystem, in this case, the oak trees. The oak trees get established in the shade of a nurse plant or a pioneer species. And eventually the oaks, which are long-lived, can grow up and finally restore the vegetation type to its original characteristic. This entire process is known as ecological succession, and it's a good thing that we have weedy plants that can very rapidly get established in soils that have been increasingly disturbed. So it's important to understand what weeds are, what weedy characteristics in plants can be. And in our landscapes, we want to try to work with nature and not against nature. We want to create conditions that are favorable to our desired plants. And we want to eliminate the recurrence of weedy plants that cause problems in the landscape.